My son kicked me out of my own house, so I sold it and left him homeless. 3 simple words can change everything. Get out, Mom. When Margaret Thompson opened her door to help her struggling son, she never imagined becoming a stranger in her own home. Sometimes the deepest wounds come from those we love most. This is her story of heartbreak, strength, and the moment she finally took back control. Subscribe to witness Margaret's incredible transformation from doormat to warrior. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. The autumn leaves scattered across Margaret Thompson's front yard as she peered through her living room curtains. At 74, her weathered hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from anxiety. Her son's SUV pulled into the driveway, packed to the brim with suitcases and boxes. It's just temporary, Margaret whispered to herself, smoothing down her cardigan. Just until they get back on their feet. The doorbell rang. She took a deep breath and opened the door to her modest single-story home in Columbus, Ohio. Brian, her 45-year-old son, stood there with his wife Tina and teenage stepdaughter Lily. His once confident posture was gone, replaced by the slumped shoulders of a defeated man. "Thanks for this, Mom," Brian said, not quite meeting her eyes. "We really appreciate it." Margaret embraced her son. "Of course, honey. Family helps family." Tina offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Nice place? Quaint." Her gaze swept critically over the floral wallpaper and vintage furniture. Lily remained glued to her phone, not bothering to look up. "I prepared the guest room for you and Tina," Margaret said, leading them inside. "And the den has a pull-out sofa for Lily." "Actually," Brian interjected, setting down a heavy box in the middle of Margaret's meticulously arranged living room, "we were thinking we'd take the master." "More space, you know?" Margaret froze. "My bedroom? It makes more sense, Mom," Brian continued, his voice taking on a patronizing tone she'd never heard before. "Your arthritis makes those 3 steps to the master bathroom dangerous. We're just thinking about your safety." Before Margaret could respond, Tina chimed in. "Plus, we need the closet space, and Lily needs her privacy. A teenager can't sleep on a pull-out couch for a month." "A month?" Margaret's voice wavered. "I thought you said a few weeks." Brian and Tina exchanged a look. "Well, finding a new job might take a bit," Brian said. "But don't worry, we won't overstay our welcome." 3 hours later, Margaret sat on the edge of the unfamiliar guest bed, surrounded by hastily relocated belongings. The framed photo of her late husband, Robert, had been carelessly placed on the nightstand, glass cracked in the corner. 47 years of marriage, reduced to a damaged memory. From the kitchen, she heard Tina's voice. "God, did you see all those knickknacks? It's like a grandma museum in here." "Just be nice," Brian responded, lowering his voice. "It's only temporary." "These curtains are coming down tomorrow," Tina continued. "And that wallpaper has got to go. I can't live like this." Margaret's throat tightened. She glanced around the small guest room, barely 10 feet square, walls bare where her cherished paintings once hung. The sounds of furniture being dragged across her hardwood floors echoed through the house. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, Margaret heard laughter from the living room, her living room. The TV volume cranked too high, the clink of glasses against her antique coffee table. A tear slid down her cheek as the first intrusive thought crept into her mind. Maybe opening her door had been a terrible mistake. A week into the temporary arrangement, Margaret woke to the sound of hammering. She shuffled into her slippers and followed the noise to the living room, where she found Tina on a stepladder, removing the floral wallpaper Margaret and Robert had chosen 30 years ago. "Morning," Tina said, without looking down. "Hope we didn't wake you too early." Margaret clutched her robe tighter. "What are you doing to my walls?" "Freshening up the place," Brian called from the kitchen. He emerged with a coffee mug, Robert's favorite Yale alumni mug, and handed it to his wife. "We got a great deal on modern wallpaper, gray with a subtle pattern, much more current. But I didn't—" Margaret's protest died as Lily walked in, rolling her eyes. "Can you guys keep it down? Some people are trying to sleep." It was 9:30 a.m. Margaret had been up since 6, her lifelong habit, but had remained in her room, afraid to disturb them. "Sorry, sweetie," Tina cooed. "Go back to bed. We'll be quieter." Margaret retreated to the kitchen, her sanctuary, only to find it transformed. Her copper pots, collected over decades, were gone from their hooks. The refrigerator had been stripped of her magnets and shopping lists. A sleek coffee machine sat where her reliable percolator once stood. She opened the fridge. Her carefully prepared casserole was missing. replaced by protein shakes and pre-packaged meals. We reorganized a bit, Brian said, startling her. Tina thought the kitchen needed a more efficient layout. Margaret nodded silently and reached for the cabinet where she kept her special blend of tea. Oh, we moved those to the back pantry, Brian added. They were taking up prime real estate. At the community center that afternoon, Margaret sat at her usual spot in watercolor class, brush hovering motionless over paper. You okay, Mags? Her friend Diane asked, noticing her untouched painting. Margaret forced a smile. Just tired. The house is a bit lively with everyone there. How's it going with Brian and his family? Margaret's hand trembled slightly. They're settling in. That evening, she returned home to find her garden shed reorganized. Her carefully labeled seed packets were dumped into a single box, her handcrafted markers tossed aside. At dinner, Margaret tried initiating conversation. I thought I might make my pot roast tomorrow. It was always your favorite. Brian. Actually, Tina interjected, we're trying to cut back on red meat. I've planned our meals for the week already. Vegan stir-fry tomorrow. Margaret looked down at her plate, some kind of quinoa bowl she barely recognized as food. Later, searching for her reading glasses, Margaret discovered them broken in the trash bin. When she mentioned it to Brian, he shrugged. They were pretty dated, Mom. We'll get you modern ones that don't make you look so elderly. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret crept to the living room. In the moonlight, she barely recognized her own home. The walls were half stripped, furniture rearranged, and family photos replaced with abstract prints. In the corner stood a small wooden table, the last project Robert had completed before his illness. Now it held Tina's designer handbag and car keys, a coffee ring staining its polished surface. Margaret ran her fingertips along the edge, remembering Robert's hands sanding it smooth. Something shifted inside her chest, not quite anger, not quite resolve, but the first kindling of a fire long extinguished. The woman who had silently retreated to the guest room that first night wasn't gone, but something was awakening within her, something with teeth. Margaret stood in line at Riverside Community Bank, clutching her deposit slip. Her Social Security check had arrived yesterday, the money that kept her modest lifestyle afloat. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, beckoned her forward. Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. How are you today? Just fine, dear, Margaret replied automatically, sliding her check and ID across the counter. The teller's fingers tapped at her keyboard, then paused. She frowned. I'm sorry. There seems to be an issue with your account. Issue? Margaret leaned forward. What kind of issue? It says here, the teller lowered her voice. Someone attempted to add a second name to your account yesterday. Did you authorize this? Margaret's heart stuttered. No, absolutely not. The teller slid a form across the counter. The request was declined because it lacked proper documentation, but the applicant was listed as Brian Thompson. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Margaret's sensible shoes. Brian had tried to access her bank account, her only source of income, without asking. Is everything all right, Mrs. Thompson? The teller's concerned voice sounded distant. Yes, she managed. Thank you for catching this. Outside the bank, Margaret sat on a bench, hands shaking. Her phone buzzed with a text from Brian. Where are you? Tina needs help moving furniture. She ignored it and called Diane instead. 20 minutes later, they sat in a quiet corner of Maggie's favorite diner. Margaret hadn't touched her coffee. I don't understand, she whispered. What would he want with my account? Diane reached across the table. Maybe it's time to face facts, Maggie. They're not just staying temporarily. Margaret's phone buzzed again. 3 missed calls from Brian. I should get back, she said, rising. Diane grabbed her wrist. No, you're coming home with me. Just for a bit. You need perspective. At Diane's cozy apartment, Margaret borrowed a laptop and logged into her email, something she rarely did. 62 unread messages. She scrolled through, stopping at one from Columbus Realty Group. Thank you for your property inquiry. Margaret hadn't contacted any realty groups. She opened the email. Dear Mr. Thompson, thank you for your interest in listing the property at 1847 Maple Avenue. As requested, we've prepared an initial valuation. Her address, her home. With trembling fingers, she checked her deleted folder. There it was, a forwarded email from her insurance company sent to Brian's address. He had accessed her account. Margaret called the realty company immediately. The agent confirmed. Brian Thompson had inquired about selling the house. claiming to have power of attorney for his elderly mother, who was considering assisted living options. That evening, Margaret returned home with new eyes. She noticed the measuring tape on the kitchen counter, the brochures for assisted living facilities poorly hidden beneath magazines, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. "Where have you been?" Brian demanded when she walked in. "We were worried." "The bank," Margaret replied, watching his expression carefully. "They had some questions about my account." A flicker of something, alarm, guilt, crossed his face before he composed himself. "Just looking out for you, Mom. Making sure your finances are in order." "And the realtor?" she asked quietly. "Were you looking out for me then too?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. In the kitchen doorway, Tina appeared, her smile sharp as broken glass. "You shouldn't worry about these things, Margaret," she said smoothly. "At your age, a big house is such a burden. We're just exploring options." "For me," Margaret stated. "Not a question." "For everyone," Brian corrected. "Family helps family, right, Mom?" The words she had spoken so earnestly just weeks ago now echoed back as mockery. Margaret straightened her shoulders. For the first time since they arrived, she looked her son directly in the eyes. "Yes," she said, "family helps family, until they don't." The community center hummed with activity as Margaret settled into her usual chair in the corner of the painting class. Her canvas remained blank, while others around her had already blocked in landscapes and still lifes. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up a brush. "You haven't touched your paints in weeks," observed Eleanor, a spry octogenarian who had become a fixture at the center after her husband's passing. "Still trouble at home?" Margaret nodded, unable to find words for the heaviness in her chest. "Margaret Thompson?" a deep voice called from the doorway. She turned to see Daniel Carter, a silver-haired man in his 70s whom she recognized from the center's administrative office. He had been Robert's friend years ago before retiring from his law practice. "Dan," she greeted him with a tired smile. "How are you?" "Better than you from the looks of it." He pulled up a chair beside her. "Eleanor mentioned you've had some unwelcome house guests." Margaret flinched. "It's family, Dan. My son needs help. And instead, he's helping himself to your home." Daniel's directness made Margaret wince. "I heard they're talking about selling it." The paintbrush snapped in Margaret's grip. "How did you know that?" "Columbus is a small town when you're our age." Daniel leaned closer. "I still have my license, Maggie. I still practice occasionally, pro bono, for friends." After class, they sat in the center's quiet cafeteria. Daniel placed a folder on the table between them. "Your husband was smarter than most," he said. "After he got sick, Robert came to see me, had me update all your documentation, including the house deed." Margaret frowned. "I don't understand." "The house is in a living trust, Maggie. Your name only. Brian has no legal claim to it whatsoever, and no power to sell it without your explicit consent." She stared at the documents. Robert's signature bold at the bottom of the page. Even after death, he was protecting her. "Furthermore," Daniel continued, sliding another paper forward, "without a proper power of attorney, which you haven't granted, Brian cannot make financial or medical decisions for you." "He tried to access my bank account," Margaret whispered. Daniel's expression darkened. "That's elder financial abuse, Maggie. It's a crime." The word abuse hung in the air between them. Margaret had never considered herself a victim. She was simply a mother helping her son. "What can I do?" Her voice was barely audible. "You have options." Daniel outlined them methodically. "Legal notices, eviction procedures, restraining orders if necessary. But first, you need to safeguard yourself." He helped her call the bank, placing additional security on her accounts. He showed her how to check her credit report, how to secure her personal documents. "Take these home and hide them," he instructed, handing her the folder. "And get me these papers from your home office. Your deed, your will, anything financial." That evening, Margaret walked into her house with new purpose. Brian and Tina were in the living room, furniture rearranged yet again. The roll-top desk where Margaret kept important papers, her desk, had been moved to a corner, partially obscured by Tina's exercise equipment. "Mom, where have you been all day?" Brian asked, not bothering to look up from his phone. "Painting," she replied, moving toward the desk. Tina stepped into her path. "We need to talk about Thanksgiving. We're having 10 people over. Brian's networking. We'll need to use your good china." Margaret sidestepped her. "My china stays in the cabinet." "Mom!" Brian's tone sharpened. "Tina's trying to help us get back on our feet. These connections are important. Margaret reached her desk, finding it locked. Where's the key to my desk? Brian and Tina exchanged glances. We had to organize some papers, Brian said carefully. Tax stuff, for the house. Margaret extended her hand, palm up. The key, Brian. For the first time since they arrived, Brian looked uncertain. In that moment, Margaret saw something she'd been missing, fear in her son's eyes, not of her, but of failing, of losing control. And with that realization came power. He won't give me the key, Margaret told Daniel the next morning. They sat in his small home office, surrounded by law books and framed diplomas. Said he misplaced it. Daniel's expression hardened. Then we move faster. I've drafted these papers. He slid 3 documents across his desk. A formal notice to vacate, a cease and desist regarding your financial matters, and a new power of attorney naming me as your representative, not Brian. Margaret's hand hovered over the documents. This feels so final. It's protection, Maggie. Daniel's voice softened. Sign them or don't. But know that every day you wait gives Brian more opportunity to undermine you. She stared at her name typed neatly on the dotted line. Robert would have signed immediately. Robert never let anyone take advantage of him. I need time to think, she said, rising from the chair. At the community center's small cafe, Margaret stirred sugar into her coffee while Diane watched her with concern. You've lost weight, Diane observed, and you're jumping at shadows. Margaret's spoon clinked against the ceramic. I found my medical records in Brian's briefcase last night, and pharmacy printouts. He's been going through my prescriptions. For what purpose? Diane asked. To build a case. Margaret's voice was steady, despite the tremor in her hands. That I'm incompetent, unable to care for myself. Diane reached across the table. You need to get them out, Maggie. They're my family. Family doesn't steal your house. The words hung between them, undeniable. That afternoon, Margaret visited Columbus First Bank and opened a new account, one Brian knew nothing about. She transferred most of her funds, leaving just enough in the old account to avoid suspicion. Next, she visited a locksmith. When she returned home, Brian's car was missing, but Tina sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. The house smelled of unfamiliar perfume and cigarette smoke, poorly masked by air freshener. Where's my china? Margaret asked, noticing the empty cabinet. Tina didn't look up. Storage. We needed the space for practical things. My china is practical to me, Margaret replied, voice steady. Where did you put it? God, Margaret, it's just old dishes. Tina sighed dramatically. We packed them away in the attic or basement, somewhere. Margaret placed her purse on the counter and extracted an envelope. This is for you and Brian. Tina glanced at it disinterestedly. What is it? Your cookie recipe? It's a formal notice. You have 30 days to find alternate accommodation. Tina's head snapped up. Excuse me? I'm reclaiming my home, Margaret said simply. Tina's laugh was cold. Brian said you might get difficult. That's why we've been documenting your memory lapses. What lapses? The stove you left on. The bills you forgot to pay? The midnight wandering? Tina's smile was venomous. All very concerning for a woman your age. Margaret felt ice in her veins. I never left the stove on. The fire department report says otherwise. Tina held up her phone, showing a document Margaret had never seen. Funny how official records work. Before Margaret could respond, a key turned in the front door. Brian entered, carrying grocery bags. Mom, you're home early. His false cheer faltered when he saw the envelope in Tina's hand. What's that? Your mother thinks she's evicting us, Tina said, voice dripping with condescension. Brian set down the groceries slowly. Mom, I think you're confused again. Remember what the doctor said about your medication? Margaret stood perfectly still, suddenly understanding the game they'd been playing, and how much darker it was than she had imagined. Margaret didn't confront Brian and Tina after their accusations. Instead, she retreated to her room, closed the door, and made 2 calls, one to Daniel, the other to Diane. Then she sat at the small vanity mirror, studying her reflection. The woman who stared back looked frail, diminished. Her silver hair hung limply around her face, her posture stooped from weeks of trying to shrink herself in her own home. Robert wouldn't recognize this version of her. The thought stung more than any of Brian's manipulations. The next morning, Margaret left before dawn. She withdrew $5,000 from her new account and visited a small salon downtown owned by Diane's niece, Rebecca. Are you sure about this? Rebecca asked, fingering Margaret's long silver strands. Margaret nodded. Very sure. 3 hours later, Margaret emerged transformed. Her waist-length gray hair, which she'd worn the same way for 40 years, was gone, replaced by a sleek, chin-length bob with subtle auburn highlights. Rebecca had called in a makeup artist friend who showed Margaret how to accentuate her blue eyes and high cheekbones. Next stop, Nordstrom. Margaret had worn nothing but shapeless cardigans and elastic waist pants since Robert's death. Today, she purchased tailored slacks, fitted blouses, and a striking red blazer that made her stand taller just trying it on. By late afternoon, she arrived at Daniel's office, looking nothing like the woman who had shuffled in yesterday. "Margaret!" Daniel stood when she entered, obviously startled. "You look like myself again," she finished for him. "I've made a decision." She signed all 3 documents without hesitation. Daniel notarized them immediately. "I'll file these today," he promised, "and I've spoken with Simon Edwards at the police department. He's sending an officer to accompany you home." Margaret shook her head. "Not yet. There's one more thing I need to do first." At the hardware store, she purchased new locks for every door in her house. The locksmith who had visited yesterday had made identical copies of her existing keys, copies now in Margaret's possession, not Brian's. It was nearly 7 when Margaret finally returned home. She found Brian, Tina, and Lily in the living room, boxes scattered around them. "Jesus, Mom, where have you—" Brian's words died as he took in her appearance. "What did you do to yourself?" Margaret set down her shopping bags. "I decided it was time for a change." Tina's eyes narrowed. "Is that my lipstick shade?" "No, it's mine." Margaret moved to the center of the room, noticing how Brian and Tina unconsciously backed away. "I see you're packing." Brian cleared his throat. "Just organizing some things." "Mom, we need to talk about—" "I've changed the locks on the shed and my bedroom," Margaret interrupted. "You are not to enter either without my express permission." Tina scoffed. "This is ridiculous. Brian, tell her." But Brian was staring at his mother with new wariness. The fragile woman he'd been manipulating had vanished. In her place stood someone who reminded him uncomfortably of his father when Robert had meant business. "And this," Margaret continued, removing a document from her purse, "is notice that I've revoked all permissions previously given to access my medical records, financial statements, or legal documents, effective immediately." "Mom, you're not thinking clearly," Brian attempted, but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret smiled, a smile neither warm nor forgiving. "Actually, Brian, for the first time in weeks, I'm thinking very clearly indeed." She ascended the stairs to her bedroom, the sharp click of her new shoes echoing through the suddenly silent house. Behind her, she heard Tina's harsh whisper, "She's on to us." The following morning, Margaret woke at 5 a.m., her mind clear despite having slept only a few hours. She dressed in one of her new outfits, charcoal slacks and a powder blue blouse that brought out her eyes, and applied her makeup with steady hands. The woman in the mirror looked determined, focused, like Robert before a big court case. She opened her bedroom door and listened. The house was silent, perfect. Moving quietly down the hallway, Margaret paused at the guest room where Brian and Tina now slept. A thin stripe of light showed beneath the door. They were awake, probably plotting. She continued past without hesitation. In the kitchen, Margaret prepared coffee, savoring the rich aroma. She hadn't made coffee in her own kitchen for weeks. It felt like reclaiming territory, her territory. At exactly 6:15 a.m., there was a soft knock at the back door. Margaret opened it to find Officer Simon Edwards, a former student of Robert's from his teaching days, and a locksmith. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson," Officer Edwards whispered. "Daniel briefed me." "You sure about this?" Margaret nodded. "Absolutely sure." While the locksmith quietly began replacing the front and back door locks, Margaret led Officer Edwards to her home office. The roll-top desk remained locked. "Can you get this open without damaging it?" she asked. The officer examined the antique desk. "We can try a Slim Jim. If that doesn't work, we'll need to force it." The locksmith joined them, producing a set of delicate tools. Within minutes, the desk drawer slid open, revealing Margaret's papers in disarray. Many were missing. "Document everything," Officer Edwards instructed, photographing the desk. "We'll need evidence of tampering." Margaret methodically went through each drawer while the officer took notes. Her will, altered with crude forgery. Bank statements with Brian's handwriting in the margins. A half-completed power of attorney form with her signature, clearly copied from her driver's license. This is serious elder fraud, Mrs. Thompson, Officer Edwards said grimly. Criminal charges could be filed. Margaret's hands trembled, but her voice was steady. Do what you must. As the officer catalogued the evidence, Margaret extracted a small velvet box from a hidden compartment known only to her. Inside lay Robert's signet ring and her grandmother's sapphire pendant, both missing from her jewelry box weeks ago. When the locksmith finished with the doors, Margaret handed him a key. The master bedroom next. I want the locks changed and only one key made. At 7:30 a.m., the sound of movement came from upstairs. Footsteps approached the kitchen, then stopped abruptly at the sight of a uniformed officer. What's going on? Brian demanded, tightening his bathrobe belt. Mom, why is there a cop in our house? My house, Margaret corrected, not looking up from the documents she and the officer were organizing. Officer Edwards is helping me recover some missing property. Tina appeared behind Brian, her face pale beneath hastily applied makeup. This is ridiculous. Brian, call our lawyer. Your lawyer can contact the department, Officer Edwards replied. We're documenting evidence of document tampering, financial exploitation, and theft. Brian's face flushed. Mom, you don't understand what you're doing. Margaret finally looked up, meeting her son's gaze with steel in her eyes. I understand perfectly. You stole from me. You tried to take my home. You attempted to declare me incompetent. We were trying to protect you, Brian insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. From whom? Margaret's question hung in the air between them. The officer cleared his throat. Mr. Thompson, I suggest you and your family remain in the guest room while we finish our business. Mrs. Thompson has requested that you vacate the premises by noon today. That's impossible. We have nowhere to go, Tina shrieked. Margaret turned back to her papers. That sounds like a personal problem. By 11:45 a.m., the morning's quiet precision had deteriorated into chaos. Brian paced the living room, alternating between pleading with Margaret and shouting into his phone at various friends who had all, apparently, declined to take in his family on such short notice. Tina stormed through the house, haphazardly throwing possessions into suitcases and trash bags, her mascara smeared beneath red-rimmed eyes. This is elder abuse in reverse, she spat when Margaret entered the kitchen. How does it feel to put your own family on the street? Margaret calmly poured herself a cup of tea. About the same as it felt when you tried to put me in a nursing home against my will. Officer Edwards remained by the front door, silently observing. 2 additional officers had arrived to assist, stationed near the family's packed belongings to ensure nothing of Margaret's accidentally left with them. 10 minutes, one of the officers announced. Lily emerged from the bathroom, eyes swollen from crying. The teenager had been the only one to pack quietly, without accusations or drama. Now she stood uncertainly in the hallway, clutching a small backpack. Grandma? Her voice was small. Can I talk to you? Alone? Margaret hesitated, then nodded toward her bedroom. Once inside with the door closed, Lily's composure crumbled. Please don't make us leave, she sobbed. Dad says we might have to sleep in the car. It's getting cold at night. Margaret's heart twisted. She reached out to smooth Lily's hair, but the girl flinched away. Your parents made choices, Lily. Bad ones. They were desperate, Lily whispered. Dad lost everything in that investment. Mom's been having panic attacks. They didn't know what else to do. Margaret studied her granddaughter. They could have asked for help, honestly. Instead, they tried to steal my home and destroy my reputation. I know. Lily wiped her eyes. I heard them planning. I should have warned you, but they're my parents. Outside the bedroom, Brian's voice rose in desperation. Mom, the officer says time's up, please. Margaret took a deep breath. I can't let them stay, Lily. Not after what they did. But she reached for her purse and extracted an envelope. This is for you. Only you. It's enough for a decent hotel for 2 weeks. Lily stared at the envelope. Why? Because you're not responsible for their actions, and because despite everything, you're still my family. When they emerged from the bedroom, Brian immediately noticed the envelope in Lily's hand. What's that? Before Lily could answer, Margaret stepped between them. It's private, between me and my granddaughter. Time's up, folks, Officer Edwards announced. Vehicles need to be removed from the property now. Brian made one last desperate attempt. Mom, please, just a few more days. We'll figure something out. Margaret approached her son, close enough to see the stubble he hadn't bothered to shave that morning, the shadows beneath his eyes. In that moment, She saw glimpses of the little boy who'd once skinned his knee on her driveway, the teenager who'd needed help with algebra, the young man she'd helped move into his first apartment. Her voice softened, but her resolve didn't waver. You tried to take everything from me, Brian. My home, my dignity, my independence, even my memories of your father. I didn't mean— Yes, you did. Margaret's words cut through his excuses. You meant every bit of it, and I will never, ever forget that. As the officers escorted them to the door, Tina turned back, venom in her expression. You'll regret this, old woman. When you're alone and sick, you'll wish you had family. Margaret stood in her doorway, straight-backed and clear-eyed. I'd rather be alone than be abused by the people who should love me most. The door closed with finality. Through the window, Margaret watched her son's family load their remaining possessions into their car. The officers waited until they drove away before approaching her one last time. We'll file the report, Officer Edwards assured her. Will you be all right alone tonight? Margaret looked around at her reclaimed home. I'm not alone, she said. For the first time in months, I have myself back. 3 days of silence stretched into a week. Margaret spent the time reclaiming her space, rehanging her curtains, retrieving her china from a dusty corner of the basement, and scrubbing away the last traces of Tina's perfume from the furniture. Each night, she slept soundly in her own bedroom, the new locks a comforting barrier between her and the outside world. On the 8th day, the emails began. Mom, we need to talk, read the first one. This misunderstanding has gone too far. Margaret deleted it without responding. The next day, Mom, Lily's school counselor is concerned about her instability. She needs her grandmother. Delete. By the 3rd day, the tone shifted. I've spoken with Dr. Mercer about your erratic behavior. He's concerned about possible cognitive decline. We can help. Margaret forwarded that one to Daniel. On the morning of the 10th day, she opened her front door to find an official-looking envelope. Inside was a petition for guardianship, citing Margaret's deteriorating mental condition and inability to make sound financial decisions. Brian had found a doctor, not her doctor, willing to sign an affidavit questioning her competence. Her hands didn't shake as she called Daniel. Her voice didn't waver as she described the document. Something in her had hardened, like sap crystallizing into amber. Don't worry, Daniel assured her. We've documented everything. Their petition won't stand. That afternoon, as Margaret waited for her painting class to begin, a text arrived from an unknown number. Grandma, it's Lily. Dad doesn't know I'm texting. They're saying terrible things about you. Dad filed something with the court. Mom says they'll get the house when you're declared incompetent. Margaret showed the message to Diane, who'd become her constant ally. They're desperate, Diane observed, and desperate people make mistakes. That evening, Margaret's doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw Brian standing alone on her porch, shoulders hunched against the autumn chill. For a moment, maternal instinct nearly overcame her resolve. Instead of opening the door, she pressed the intercom button Daniel had installed. Yes? Mom, please. Can we talk? Brian's voice crackled through the speaker. I'm alone. I just want to apologize. Any communication needs to go through my attorney, Margaret replied, her finger steady on the button. Mom, this is ridiculous. We're family. His voice took on the patronizing tone she'd grown to despise. You're not thinking clearly. Remember when Dad died? How confused you were? This is just like that. Margaret's throat tightened. Robert's death had indeed left her disoriented with grief, a vulnerability Brian was now weaponizing against her. I remember everything, Brian, including what you tried to do to me. I was trying to protect you. From what? My own home? My own money? She paused, suddenly understanding. Or from knowing what you did with your inheritance. Brian's silence confirmed her suspicion. The inheritance. Robert had left their son a considerable sum, separate from Margaret's assets, money that should have secured Brian's future. You lost it all, didn't you? She continued. That's why you needed my house. Mom, please. Goodbye, Brian. She released the intercom button and watched through the window as her son remained on the porch for several minutes, alternating between looking defeated and furious. Finally, he left a thick envelope by the door and walked away. Margaret waited until his car disappeared before retrieving the envelope. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Margaret at odd angles, appearing confused or tired. Margaret's medications arranged to look chaotic. Old notes she'd written, presented without context. The last photo showed her bedroom, taken during their stay, with drawers left open and belongings scattered, staged to look like the room of someone with dementia. Margaret didn't cry. She carefully placed each photo in a new folder labeled Evidence, her hands now steady as a surgeon's. The annual Columbus Community Harvest Festival transformed the town square into a bustling marketplace every October. For 20 years, Margaret had attended quietly, usually purchasing a few crafts and enjoying Eleanor's prize-winning pumpkin bread. This year, however, was different. "You're sure about this?" Diane asked as they approached the central pavilion. Margaret smoothed her crimson blazer and adjusted the delicate sapphire pendant at her throat, her grandmother's jewelry, reclaimed from Brian's theft. Absolutely certain. 3 weeks ago, Eleanor had mentioned the festival committee was desperate for vendors after several cancellations. On impulse, Margaret had volunteered her watercolors. Now, beneath a small canopy, dozens of her paintings stood displayed on easels and tables, autumn landscapes, still lifes, and abstract pieces she'd created during her recent artistic rebirth. "Margaret Thompson, is that you?" Evelyn Pierce, the library director, approached with wide eyes. "I hardly recognized you. Your hair looks stunning." "Thank you," Margaret replied with a confidence that no longer felt foreign. "I decided it was time for a change." Throughout the morning, similar exchanges repeated. Former acquaintances did double takes. Neighbors who'd barely spoken to her in years stopped to admire her artwork and comment on her transformation. By noon, Margaret had sold 7 paintings. As she wrapped a small landscape for a customer, she felt a familiar presence approach. The hair on her arms stood up before she even raised her eyes. "Mom?" Brian stood at her booth, Lily half hidden behind him. He'd lost weight since she'd last seen him. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. "Brian?" Margaret acknowledged coolly, finishing with her customer before turning to him. "Can I help you?" He glanced around nervously, taking in the displayed artwork, the sold tags, the crowd of admirers. "You're selling paintings?" "I am." Margaret's voice remained steady, though her heart hammered. "Did you need something?" Nearby conversations quieted as people sensed the tension. Diane moved protectively closer to Margaret's side. "Could we talk privately?" Brian asked, lowering his voice. "I'm working," Margaret replied. "My art show runs until 5. Brian's jaw tightened. "Mom, be reasonable. We have a court date next week." Margaret smiled thinly. "Yes, I know. My attorney is prepared." "You don't understand." Brian stepped closer, his voice a harsh whisper. "It doesn't have to be like this. We can come to an arrangement before things get ugly." Margaret set down her wrapping materials. She stood straighter, meeting her son's gaze directly. "Things got ugly the moment you tried to steal my home and declare me incompetent. There's no arrangement to be made." Eleanor appeared beside them, her expression concerned. "Everything all right, Maggie?" "Just fine, Eleanor." Margaret's voice carried clearly. "My son was just congratulating me on my successful debut as an artist." Brian flushed, aware of the growing audience. "Mom, please." "Actually, I'm rather busy," Margaret interrupted. "As you can see, I'm quite competent to manage my affairs, artistic and otherwise." A murmur passed through the onlookers. Several nodded approvingly. Brian seemed to shrink beneath their collective gaze. "Lily wanted to see you," he attempted, pushing his daughter forward. The teenager shuffled awkwardly, then surprised everyone by throwing her arms around Margaret. "Your paintings are amazing, Grandma," she whispered. "I'm sorry about everything." Margaret returned the embrace, her composure nearly cracking. "Thank you, sweetheart." When Lily pulled away, Margaret noticed a familiar envelope peeking from the girl's pocket. The money she'd given her, still unspent. "We should go," Brian muttered, tugging at Lily's sleeve. As they turned to leave, Margaret called after them. "Brian." He paused, hope flashing briefly across his face. "I'll see you in court." Her voice was clear, unwavering, and loud enough for everyone to hear. After they disappeared into the crowd, Eleanor squeezed Margaret's shoulder. "Robert would have been proud. Maggie, you've got his backbone after all." For the first time since her husband's death, Margaret felt the truth of those words down to her bones. The Franklin County Courthouse loomed imposingly against the pale November sky. Margaret sat perfectly straight on the polished wooden bench outside Courtroom C, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a tailored navy suit, another new purchase, and pearl earrings that had been Robert's last gift to her. Daniel reviewed documents beside her, occasionally murmuring reassurances. On her other side sat Dr. Laurel Chen, her actual physician of 15 years, who had agreed to testify regarding Margaret's excellent cognitive health. "Remember," Daniel said quietly, "let me do the talking. Only respond when directly addressed by the judge." Margaret nodded, her gaze fixed on the double doors across the hallway. Through the small windows, she could see Brian huddled with a balding attorney. Tina sat behind them, her expression sour. There was no sign of Lily. At precisely 9:30 a.m., the bailiff called them in. The proceedings began with clinical efficiency. Brian's attorney, a Mr. Gladwell, presented their petition for guardianship, citing concerns about Margaret's erratic behavior and sudden personality changes. He submitted the affidavit from Dr. Mercer, who had never treated Margaret but claimed her symptoms were consistent with early-stage dementia. When Daniel rose for the defense, his approach was methodical. He presented Margaret's clean bill of health from Dr. Chen, documentation of Brian's financial troubles, and evidence of the attempted bank account access. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Daniel continued, "we have photographic evidence that the respondent staged conditions in Mrs. Thompson's home to create the appearance of mental decline." The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, examined the photos with narrowed eyes. "Mrs. Thompson," she finally said, "I'd like to hear from you directly." Margaret rose, feeling oddly calm. "Yes, Your Honor. Can you explain in your own words why you believe your son has filed this petition?" Margaret glanced at Brian, who wouldn't meet her eyes. "My son lost his inheritance through poor investments," she began, her voice clear and steady. "When he and his family moved into my home, supposedly temporarily, they began systematically taking over. When I resisted, they attempted to have me declared incompetent so they could sell my house and access my accounts." The judge nodded. "And your relationship with your son prior to this?" "We were close, I thought." Margaret's composure wavered slightly. "I never imagined he would betray me this way." Brian jerked to his feet. "That's not fair. We were trying to help you." "Mr. Thompson, sit down," the judge warned. "Mom," Brian pleaded, ignoring the warning. "You were forgetting things, leaving doors unlocked. We were worried." "The doors were unlocked because you took my keys," Margaret replied evenly. "The stove was left on because Tina disabled the automatic shutoff to make it look like I was careless." "That's a lie," Tina shouted from behind. The judge banged her gavel. "One more outburst and I'll clear the court." After testimony from Dr. Chen and cross-examination, the judge called a brief recess. When she returned, her decision was swift and unequivocal. "This court finds no evidence whatsoever of cognitive impairment in Mrs. Thompson. On the contrary, I find troubling evidence of attempted elder abuse and financial exploitation by the petitioners." She looked directly at Brian. "Mr. Thompson, this petition is denied. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order preventing you and your wife from coming within 500 feet of your mother or her property for the next 12 months. As they exited the courtroom, Brian rushed toward Margaret, ignoring the bailiff's warning. "Mom, please, we can fix this." His voice cracked. "We're family." Margaret regarded her son, this stranger wearing the face of the boy she'd raised. For a fleeting moment, she saw every version of him superimposed. The toddler with scraped knees, the teenager with college dreams, the man who'd tried to destroy her. "Family doesn't do what you did, Brian," she said softly. "Some things can't be fixed." She turned away, leaving him standing alone in the courthouse corridor, diminished by the weight of what he'd lost. Not a house or money, but something far more precious and irreplaceable. Spring came early to Columbus that year. Pale green buds dotted the maple trees along Margaret Street as she unlocked the door to Maggie's Canvas, the small art studio and gallery she'd opened 3 months after the court hearing. The space, formerly a vacant storefront just 2 blocks from the community center, had been transformed with clean white walls, track lighting, and large windows that flooded the room with morning light. Margaret set her leather tote bag on the counter and began her morning routine. As she arranged fresh daisies in a vase near the entrance, she caught her reflection in the window glass. At 75, she stood taller than she had in decades. Her stylish bob framed a face that had regained its color and vitality. The haunted look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet confidence that had become her natural expression. The bell above the door chimed as Eleanor entered, carrying a tray of coffee cups. "Morning, boss," Eleanor teased, setting down the drinks. "Ready for the senior class at 10? Margaret smiled. Twice weekly, she taught watercolor to residents from local retirement communities. The same people who once pitied her now looked at her with admiration. Everything's prepared. How's the new series coming? Eleanor had become Margaret's first artist in residence, displaying her vibrant abstract paintings alongside Margaret's more traditional watercolors. The arrangement had increased business for both of them. Almost ready for the spring showcase, Eleanor replied, sipping her coffee. Daniel called, by the way. He wants to know if you're still joining him for the Symphony Friday. Margaret felt a familiar warmth rise to her cheeks. Her friendship with Daniel had gradually evolved into something more: comfortable evening dinners, lengthy philosophical discussions, and lately, his hand occasionally covering hers during conversations. Neither felt the need to label whatever was developing between them. At noon, Margaret stepped out for lunch at the cafe across the street. The owner waved her to her usual table by the window, where she could watch pedestrians while enjoying her soup and sandwich. Halfway through her meal, a hesitant figure appeared in the doorway. Lily stood awkwardly, scanning the cafe until she spotted Margaret. At 15, she'd grown taller in the 6 months since the courthouse. Her hair was shorter, her style more confident. "Hi, Grandma," she said softly, approaching the table. "Is it okay if I join you?" Margaret gestured to the empty chair. Since the restraining order against Brian and Tina, she'd maintained contact with Lily through carefully arranged meetings, supervised by a family court officer. This was their first unsupervised encounter. "How's school?" Margaret asked, studying her granddaughter's face. "Better," Lily replied. "We're staying with Dad's cousin in Cincinnati now. I started at a new school last month." They talked easily for nearly an hour, about Lily's classes, her interest in photography, her new friends. Neither mentioned Brian or Tina directly, dancing around the subject with practiced care. As they prepared to leave, Lily handed Margaret a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "I made this in art class," she said. "Thought you might like it for your gallery." Margaret unwrapped a small ceramic vase, perfectly proportioned and glazed in deep blues that matched her grandmother's pendant. "It's beautiful," Margaret whispered, genuinely moved. "I told my teacher about you," Lily continued. "How you started over, how you wouldn't let anyone take your power away." She looked down at her hands. "I want to be like that someday." Margaret reached across the table and gently lifted her granddaughter's chin. "You already are, Lily. You survived, too." That evening, Margaret sat on her porch swing, the ceramic vase beside her holding a single daisy. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. Her home was truly hers again, not just legally, but emotionally. She no longer waited for the phone to ring or jumped at unexpected sounds. The painful knot of betrayal had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something different, a hard-earned wisdom that made her stronger, not bitter. As twilight settled around her shoulders like a familiar shawl, Margaret Thompson closed her eyes and breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the sweet air of a life reclaimed. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel and don't miss the next video with more stories that will touch your heart.